Word traveled fast through the orbital station, and within 2 days everyone knew about what had happened in the cafeteria, and the story changed slightly with each retelling. But the core remained the same, and a group of human students had chosen to sit with a Vryn predator and had made bullies look foolish without raising their voices or their fists. The other species did not know what to make of this, and they discussed it in their dormitories and common areas and tried to understand the logic behind the humans' actions, and the herbivore students thought the humans were either very brave or very stupid to ally themselves with a predator. And the few other predator species at the academy watched with interest and wondered if this meant something larger was changing. In classroom 7B, things continued much as they had before, and Jiwoo sat beside Takriel and took notes during lessons, and Takriel learned to control his strength, so he stopped breaking things, and the other students gradually became accustomed to his presence, though some still gave him nervous glances. Teacher Calvin announced a new project that would span the next several weeks, and he explained that students would work in assigned groups to identify and solve a real problem that existed on the station, and the groups would be mixed species because the entire point of the integration program was to learn to work together. The groans from the students were universal and came from every species, because group projects were universally disliked, but Teacher Calvin simply smiled and began reading the assigned groups. When he announced that Jiwoo and Takril and Hyun would be working together with Pip-Pix, the small rabbit-like alien who sat in the front corner, the room went quiet, and everyone turned to look at Pip-Pix, whose ears had flattened completely against his head in terror. Pip-Pix had spent the last 2 weeks trying to be as invisible as possible, and he sat as far from Takril as the classroom allowed, and he never made eye contact with any of the predator species, and now he was being told he would have to work closely with both of Vryn and 3 humans for an extended project. After class, Pip-Pix tried to approach Teacher Calvin to request a different group, but the old teacher simply patted his shoulder and told him that growth happened outside of comfort zones, and that he had faith in all his students' ability to surprise themselves. The first group meeting was scheduled for that afternoon in one of the small study rooms that lined the library level, and Jiwoo arrived first and set up her datapad and organized her notes, and when Takril entered the room a few minutes later, she greeted him with a small nod. Hyun came next and took a seat across from them and pulled out his own materials, and they waited for Pip-Pix, who finally appeared 10 minutes late and stood in the doorway looking like he might bolt at any moment. Jiwoo gestured to the empty chair and told Pip-Pix they were glad he could make it, and her tone was so normal and casual that it seemed to confuse the small alien who had probably expected something very different. Pip-Pix sat down in the chair farthest from Takril and kept his eyes fixed on the table, and his whole body was tense and ready to run. And the first 20 minutes of the meeting were awkward because Pip-Pix barely spoke, and when he did, his voice was so quiet they could barely hear him. Jiwoo seemed to understand that pushing Pip-Pix would only make things worse, so instead she focused on the project and began asking questions about what kind of problem they should try to solve, and she directed questions to each member of the group and made sure everyone had a chance to speak. Takril suggested they look at security issues since the station had species with very different physical capabilities, and some of the emergency protocols did not account for species who could not fit through standard access panels or who could not operate equipment designed for different body types. Hyun thought they should examine the recreational facilities and how they were segregated by species when they did not need to be, and he pointed out that shared spaces could help with integration if they were designed properly. Pip-Pix said nothing until Jiwoo asked him directly what he thought, and then in his quiet voice he mentioned that the air circulation system was calibrated for average species requirements, but some species needed different atmospheric conditions, and there were students who had to stay in specially sealed dormitories because the common areas made them sick. The suggestion was good and practical, and Jiwoo immediately began taking notes and asking Pip-Pix follow-up questions about atmospheric requirements and which species were most affected. And as Pip-Pix answered, he became slightly more animated, and his voice grew a bit stronger. They decided to focus on the atmospheric problem and scheduled their next meeting for 2 days later, and as they were packing up, Takril noticed that Pip-Pix had relaxed slightly and was no longer pressed against the far wall. The pattern continued over the next several meetings, and slowly, Very slowly, Pip-Pix became more comfortable with the group, and it helped that Jiwoo had a talent for making people feel heard, and that Hyun used humor to diffuse tension, and that Takril was careful to move slowly and keep his voice gentle when speaking. During their fourth meeting, something shifted, and they were discussing the technical specifications for atmospheric sensors when Pip-Pix disagreed with one of Takril's suggestions, and instead of staying quiet like he had before, Pip-Pix explained why he thought a different approach would work better. Takril listened and considered, and then agreed that Pip-Pix was right, and thanked him for the correction, and Pip-Pix looked surprised that the Predator had accepted his input without argument. After that, Pip-Pix began contributing more actively, and they discovered that he was remarkably good at research and could find obscure technical documents and regulations that none of them would have thought to look for, and his attention to detail caught several mistakes before they became problems. The group began to function like an actual team, and Takril provided strategic thinking and could see how different parts of a problem connected, and Jiwoo kept them organized and made sure everyone's ideas were heard, and Hyun maintained morale and kept them from getting too frustrated when things did not work, and Pip-Pix did the detailed research that backed up all their proposals. Other students noticed the change and saw that the mixed species group was not just surviving but actually working well together, and some of the other groups started to copy their methods and began actually communicating across species lines, instead of just dividing the work and doing everything separately. Yuna, the quiet human girl who liked to draw, started sitting in the library during their meetings and sketching the different species she saw, and her artwork showed aliens not as the frightening or exotic creatures they were usually portrayed as, but as ordinary people studying and talking and living their lives. The tech-focused human started a small broadcast that shared news and updates about student life, and he interviewed members of different species and asked them about their homeworlds and their experiences at the academy. And slowly the station's population began to see each other as individuals, rather than representatives of their species. But not everyone was pleased with these developments, and there was a creche teacher named Instructor Vren, who taught combat training and military history, and who had been opposed to the integration program from the beginning, and he made his opinions known loudly in faculty meetings. Instructor Vren argued that Teacher Kylevin was creating dangerous alliances, and that predators and prey could never truly trust each other, and that eventually instincts would override whatever temporary peace had been established, and when that happened, people would be hurt. He predicted that the human students were making a mistake by lowering their guard around species like the Vrin, and that their death world instincts should be telling them to maintain distance and dominance, and their failure to do so showed poor judgment. Teacher Calvin listened to these arguments with his usual patience and then calmly pointed out that in 3 months of integration, there had been no violent incidents, and that students were performing better academically when they worked in diverse groups, and that perhaps Instructor Vren's predictions were based on outdated assumptions. The argument continued in various forms over the following weeks, and other teachers took sides, and some agreed with Instructor Vren that the integration was moving too fast, and that they were courting disaster, while others supported Teacher Calvin's approach and pointed to the measurable improvements in student cooperation. Meanwhile, Takril and his group continued working on their project, and they had identified 12 different species whose health was being negatively impacted by the standard atmospheric settings, and they had designed a proposal for zone-based atmospheric control that would allow different areas of the station to maintain different conditions without requiring full environmental suits. Their research was thorough, and their proposal was practical, and they had even worked out the cost analysis and implementation timeline, and when they presented their preliminary findings to Teacher Kelvin, he told them it was some of the best student work he had seen in years. During one of their later meetings, Pip-Pix mentioned that the field trip was supposed to be educational and safe and routine, because Teacher Kelvin had organized dozens of these trips over his long career, and the agricultural dome was one of the most secure areas of the station where students could see how food was grown in space and learn about the complex systems that kept everyone fed. 30 students from Classroom 7B boarded the transport shuttle that morning, and they were in good spirits because any break from normal classes was welcome. And the agricultural dome was actually interesting with its massive growing chambers and artificial sunlight, and the strange plants that had been adapted from dozens of different worlds. Jiwoo sat near the window and watched the station's exterior slide past as the shuttle moved along its designated path, and beside her, Takriel was reading something on his datapad about hydroponic systems, and behind them, Hyun and Minho were arguing cheerfully about which Earth food they missed most, and across the aisle, Pip-Pix was chattering excitedly with Nari about the xenobotany they would see. The dome was impressive when they arrived, and it stretched out in a vast curve overhead, and the air inside was warm and humid and smelled of growing things, and Teacher Kelvin led them through the entrance and began explaining the various sections and what crops grew where, and why certain species required certain conditions. The students spread out slightly as they explored and staying within the approved areas and taking notes and asking questions, and everything was proceeding exactly as planned until the alarm started blaring and emergency lights began flashing red. The voice over the intercom was calm but urgent, and it stated that there had been a structural failure in Section 7, and that all personnel should evacuate immediately and follow emergency protocols, and the students looked at each other in confusion because they were in Section 7. Teacher Kelvin immediately began moving students toward the exit, but then there was a sound like tearing metal, and the entire dome shuddered, and somewhere above them, something gave way with a shriek of breaking supports. Emergency doors slammed down throughout the section, and they were designed to contain atmospheric breaches and prevent damage from spreading. But they also trapped anyone who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. When the chaos settled, Jiwoo found herself in growing Chamber 3 with Takriel, and 6 other students, and the emergency door behind them had sealed completely, and the door ahead was blocked by fallen debris, and through the transparent walls they could see other students in other chambers, and everyone was trapped. The group consisted of Jiwoo and Takriel and Hyun and Pip-Pix and 3 herbivore students that Jiwoo did not know well, and one of them was a tall, thin alien with pale blue skin, and another was small and covered in something like scales, and the third had 4 arms and compound eyes. The chamber was large but not infinite, and it was filled with rows of growing trays and artificial light panels, and the temperature control system that was supposed to keep things warm for the plants, and now the system was failing because the structural damage had compromised the environmental controls. Within 10 minutes, everyone could see their breath in the air, and the temperature was dropping steadily, and the oxygen levels were also dropping because the ventilation system had been damaged, and the plants alone could not produce enough to sustain 8 students. Pip-Pix started breathing fast, and his ears were flat against his head, and the 3 herbivore students were pressing themselves against the far wall and staring at Takriel with wide, terrified eyes because they were trapped in an enclosed space with a predator, and their instincts were screaming at them. Takriel could smell their fear, and it was thick in the air, and every part of his evolutionary history recognized that smell and responded to it, and his muscles tensed and his pupils dilated, and his breathing changed, and something old and primal woke up in his brain. The herbivore students saw the change in Takriel, and they huddled closer, together, and one of them made a high-pitched sound of distress, and another began looking around frantically for anything that could be used as a weapon, and the fear in the chamber became almost suffocating. Yun moved closer to Jiwoo, and his posture shifted into something defensive, and his own instincts were responding to the threat of a predator in a confined space. And even though he had been sitting in class with Takriel for weeks right now, he was seeing a dangerous animal. Everything was falling apart, and panic was spreading like fire, and within seconds someone was going to do something violent, and once that started it would not stop until someone was hurt, or worse. Then Jiwoo stood up, and her voice cut through the rising panic like a blade, and she did not shout. But her tone carried absolute authority, and she told everyone to stop and listen to her right now. The command was so unexpected and so firm that everyone froze and looked at her, and Jiwoo was the smallest person in the chamber, but in that moment she seemed larger, and her calm expression had been replaced by something harder and more focused. She spoke quickly and clearly and told them that they had approximately 3 hours before rescue arrived based on standard emergency protocols, and in that time they needed to manage 3 problems, which were oxygen and heat and panic, and if they did not work together they would not survive, and it was that simple. The herbivore students started to protest, and one of them pointed at Takriel and said they could not work with a predator who was clearly about to attack them, and Jiwoo cut him off and said that Takriel had been sitting in their classroom for weeks without attacking anyone, and that fear was making them see threats that did not exist. She turned to Takriel and asked him directly if he was going to attack anyone, and her voice was steady and showed no fear, and Takriel struggled to respond because his instincts were still screaming at him, but he managed to shake his head and force words out, and he said he would not. Jiwoo nodded as if this settled the matter, and then she began giving orders, and she told Takriel that his species had better hearing than anyone else, and she needed him to position himself near the wall and listen for rescue teams and alert them when he heard equipment or voices. By giving Takriel a task and a purpose, she was redirecting his attention away from the fear smell and away from his predator instincts, and Takriel understood what she was doing, and he was grateful. And he moved to the wall and pressed his ear against it and focused on listening. Jiwoo told Hyun to help her gather all the thermal blankets from the emergency kit and to start covering the growing trays to trap what heat remained. And she told Pip-Pix to calculate their oxygen consumption rate based on the number of people and the size of the chamber. She assigned the herbivore students to search for any gaps in the walls where cold air was entering and to stuff them with insulation material from the damaged equipment, and by giving everyone a specific job, she was overriding panic with procedure. The students hesitated, but then they began moving and following her instructions because the alternative was to sit and wait and let fear consume them. And action was better than paralysis. Over the next hour, they worked together and sealed gaps and rationed their movement to conserve oxygen and huddled together for warmth under the thermal blankets, and Jiwoo kept them focused by asking for updates and making decisions about resource allocation. Takriel remained by the wall with his eyes closed and his ears straining to hear any sound beyond the chamber, and occasionally he would report what he heard. And at one point he picked up vibrations that he thought might be rescue equipment, but they were too far away still. The temperature continued to drop, and everyone was shivering now, and their breath came out in clouds, and Pip-Pix's calculations showed they had maybe 90 minutes of breathable air remaining, and the situation was becoming critical. One of the herbivore students, whose name was Trelvix, started breathing too fast and hyperventilating and using up oxygen and making himself dizzy, and Hyun moved to help him. But the student flinched away because Hyun was human and therefore dangerous. Jiwoo intervened, and she spoke to Trelvix in a low, calm voice and told him she understood he was scared, but that fear was using up his oxygen faster and she needed him to slow his breathing. And she counted breaths with him until he was breathing normally again. Then something happened that no one expected, and Trelvix asked why the humans were helping them when everyone knew humans were apex predators who should be as frightening as the Vrin, and Jiwoo looked at him with that same calm expression. She said that humans were predators, yes, and they came from a world that tried to kill them every day, and they had evolved to hunt and to fight and to survive against impossible odds, but they had also evolved to work together because on Earth the threats were so great that no individual could survive alone. She said humans had learned that the pack was stronger than the individual, and that sometimes the best way to survive was to make sure everyone around you survived too. And she said that was what they were going to do right now. The words seemed to calm something in the herbivore students, and they looked at each other and then at the humans and then at Takriel, who was still listening at the wall, and doing his job. Time passed slowly, and the cold became worse, and they huddled closer. The image of 8 students huddled together for survival in growing Chamber 3 spread across every galactic news network within hours, and the image was powerful because it showed something that most of the galaxy thought was impossible, and it showed prey species pressed close to predators for warmth, and it showed humans who were supposedly terrifying deathworlders protecting everyone equally, and it showed that survival could override ancient instincts when people chose to let it. The aftermath of the agricultural dome incident changed everything at the Academy, and the integration program that had been considered a risky experiment was suddenly being studied as a potential model, and delegations from other stations and planets began arriving to observe and ask questions and understand how Teacher Kelvin had achieved what everyone else thought was impossible. Ambassador Kang arrived 2 weeks after the incident, and she was a human diplomat who had spent 20 years working with the Galactic Council, and she was known for being practical and direct and not wasting time on diplomatic niceties when honest conversation would work better. She spent 3 days at the Academy, and she attended classes and observed students and interviewed teachers, and when she sat down with Teacher Calvin in his small office, she asked him directly how he had done it. Teacher Calvin poured tea for both of them, and his long fingers wrapped around his cup, and he smiled, that same smile he always wore, and he said he had not really done anything special. He explained that when Takriel sat beside Jiwoo on that first day, everyone expected violence or fear or confrontation, and the room was full of tension and ancient instincts and predictions of disaster, and in that moment he had made a choice. He had smiled and continued his lesson as if nothing was wrong, and by doing that he had sent a message that this was normal, and this was acceptable, and this was what he expected from his students. Ambassador Kang leaned back and said that seemed too simple, and Teacher Calvin agreed that it sounded simple, but said that simple was not the same as easy. He said that for 40 years, he had been teaching students from dozens of species, and he had seen fear and prejudice and hatred, and he had also seen kindness and curiosity and the willingness to learn, and he had learned that young people would rise to meet expectations, or they would sink to meet them. If he had treated Takriel sitting beside Jiwoo as a crisis, then it would have become a crisis, and if he had separated them or shown fear, then every student would have learned that predators and prey could not coexist peacefully. But he had smiled and expected them to behave like students, and eventually, most of them had Ambassador Kang asked about the humans and what role they had played. And Teacher Kelvin said the humans had been crucial, but perhaps not in the way people thought. He said, humans were predators from a death world, and they had evolved to survive conditions that would kill most species. And they had all the instincts and capabilities of apex hunters. And the galaxy looked at them and saw danger. But humans had also evolved something else, and they had evolved the ability to see beyond instinct and to choose their responses rather than being controlled by biology. And they had evolved pack bonding so strong that they would die for people they had only known for weeks. The humans at the academy did not see Takriel as a threat or as a curiosity, and they saw him as someone who might become part of their pack, and once they decided that they protected him and included him, and refused to let others isolate him. This behavior confused other species because it did not fit their understanding of predator behavior. And predators were supposed to compete, not cooperate, and they were supposed to establish dominance, not offer friendship. But humans did not follow those rules, and they formed bonds across species lines, and they extended trust even when it was risky. And sometimes that trust inspired others to be worthy of it. While Ambassador Kang conducted her investigation, a ship arrived at the station carrying someone else who wanted to understand what was happening, and Elder Tiernak was Takriel's grandfather, and he was a leader among the Vrin, and he had been skeptical of the integration program from the beginning. He had allowed his grandson to attend because the Galactic Council had made participation a requirement for maintaining trade agreements. But he had expected Takriel to return home, after proving that Vrin could not be civilized in the way other species demanded. When Elder Tiernak arrived, he requested a meeting with Takriel, and they sat in one of the station's conference rooms, and the old Vrin looked at his grandson with sharp golden eyes. He said that he had seen the news coverage and the images of Takriel pressed close to prey, animals, and working with humans, and apparently protecting herbivores instead of hunting them, and he wanted to know if his grandson had forgotten what it meant to be. Vrin Takriel met his grandfather's gaze and did not look away, and he said he had not forgotten anything about being Vrin, and he still had all the instincts and capabilities of his species, and he could still hunt and fight and dominate if necessary. But he had learned something his grandfather had never taught him, and he had learned that strength was not just about what you could take or what you could kill, and it was also about what you could build, and who you could trust, and what you could become. He told his grandfather about the moment in the growing chamber, when his instincts had screamed at him to attack, and how close he had come to proving everyone right, who said predators were just animals, and how Jiwoo had trusted him to choose differently. He said that choice had been harder than any fight he had ever faced, and it had required more strength than physical dominance, and he had won that fight not by giving in to his nature, but by choosing to be more than his nature. Demanded Elder Tiernak was quiet for a long time, and then he asked what the humans had offered Takriel in return for this loyalty, and Takriel said they had offered him something his own people had never given him, and they had offered him the chance to be part of a pack that was not based on fear or strength but on choice and respect. The old Vryn stood and walked to the window and looked out at the stars, and he said that the galaxy was changing, and perhaps the Vryn needed to change with it or be left behind. He did not say he approved, and he did not say he understood, but he said he would not interfere. And that was enough. The final presentations for Teacher Kelvin's group project happened 3 weeks after the agricultural dome incident, and each group stood before the class and explained what problem they had identified and what solution they proposed. Most of the projects were adequate and showed that students had learned to work together at least minimally, and they had proposals for better food distribution and improved recreational schedules and various small improvements to station life. Then Jiwoo and Takriel and Hyun and Pip-Pix presented their atmospheric control proposal, and they had refined it significantly since their initial work, and they had full technical specifications and cost analysis and implementation timeline. They explained how 12 different species were suffering health problems because the station's atmospheric controls were calibrated for average requirements, and how their zone-based system would allow different areas to maintain different conditions and how this would improve quality of life for everyone. The presentation was professional and thorough and included testimonials from affected students and data from medical records and projections for long-term health improvements, and even instructor Vren, who was watching from the back of the room, looked impressed, though he tried to hide it. When they finished, Teacher Kelvin asked if there were questions, and several students raised their hands, and the questions were thoughtful and engaged and focused on the actual proposal, rather than on the unusual composition of the group. The projects were judged by a panel of teachers and station administrators, and when the results were announced, 3 days later, Jiwoo and Takriel's group had won, and their proposal was not just a student exercise but would actually be implemented on the station. The victory was significant, not because of the prize, but because it proved that mixed species cooperation could produce results that were better than any single species could achieve alone. The term ended, and students prepared to return home for the break period, and some would not return because their families did not approve of the integration program, and some would come back with siblings and friends who wanted to see what was happening. On the last day of classes, Jiwoo sat in classroom 7B and watched other students say goodbye and exchange contact information and promise to message over the break, and she noticed that the farewells crossed species lines much more easily than they had at the beginning of the term. Takriel approached her desk and stood there with something in his hand, and when she looked up, he held out a small, carved figure, and it was made from dark wood and showed a human and a Vryn standing side by side. He said his people had a tradition of carving gifts for pack members, and that he wanted her to have this, so she would remember that she had changed things for him and for others. Jiwoo took the carving and ran her fingers over the smooth wood, and she thanked him and said she would treasure it, and then she pulled something from her bag and handed it to him. Daesung walked through the curved corridors of Galactic Academy Station Epsilon 7, with his head down and his hands tucked into the pockets of his gray uniform jacket, and the fluorescent lights overhead flickered in patterns that still made his eyes hurt, even after 3 months of living here among creatures from 100 different worlds. And he could hear the clicking sounds of Tessik's many legs on the metal floor behind him, along with the heavy footfalls of Vorn, whose violet skin seemed to glow under the station's artificial lighting system. And Daesung knew they were following him, but he kept walking toward the sparring arena because he had combat training scheduled, and missing it would only make things worse for him and for all the other humans who came to this place hoping to prove that Earth deserved a spot among the great civilizations of the galaxy. And the truth was that most aliens saw humans as weak newcomers who barely understood how to travel between stars and whose bodies were fragile, compared to species that evolved on high-gravity worlds or in the depths of toxic atmospheres. And Daesung had learned to ignore the whispers and the laughter and the casual shoves in the hallways, because fighting back would only confirm what they already believed about humans being primitive and violent. And his friend Hyo Jin always told him to keep his head down and focus on his studies, because grades and achievements would speak louder than fists ever could. And she was probably right, but it was hard to remember that when Vorn's cronies tripped him in the cafeteria, or when Tessik made jokes about human weakness that made the whole class laugh while Instructor Val pretended not to notice. And now Daesung reached the entrance to the sparring arena and pressed his palm against the scanner, and the doors slid open with a soft hiss, and he stepped inside expecting to see other students preparing for the scheduled training session, but the massive, circular room was empty except for practice weapons, hanging on the walls and training dummies standing like silent witnesses in the shadows. And his stomach tightened because he realized he had been tricked, and the training session had been moved or canceled, and nobody had bothered to tell him. And before he could turn around to leave, the doors slid shut behind him and locked with a heavy clunk that echoed through the empty space. And Vorn stepped out from behind one of the support pillars with his arms crossed over his massive chest, and a grin on his face that showed too many teeth. And Tessic skittered out from the opposite side with his compound eyes gleaming with what might have been amusement or malice or both. And two more aliens emerged from the shadows, including a scaled creature named Vix, and a floating jellyfish-like being whose name Dae Sung had never learned. And Vorn said something in his grinding language that the translation device in Dae Sung's ear rendered, "As we just want to test something and see how tough humans really are." And Dae Sung backed away slowly with his hands raised and told them this was not a good idea, and that he did not want any trouble. And Vorn laughed and said it was just a joke and just a friendly test, and that he would barely tap the human to see what happened. And Dae Sung kept backing away until his shoulders hit the cold metal wall and he had nowhere else to go. And he tried to explain that humans were not as durable as Krell warriors, and that what seemed like a light hit to Vorn could seriously injure a human. And Tessic clicked his mandibles together and said that was exactly what they wanted to find out. And Vorn stepped forward with his massive fist raised, and Dae Sung tried to dodge, but the Krell was faster than his bulk, suggested, and the punch caught Dae Sung square in the chest with a force that felt like being hit by a moving vehicle, and all the air rushed out of his lungs and his ribs screamed with pain. And he collapsed to the floor, gasping and choking and unable to draw breath. And distantly he heard the aliens laughing and making comments about human fragility and how disappointing it was that humans broke so easily. And Vorn was saying something about how he had held back most of his strength, and this was barely a love tap. And Dae Sung's vision started to blur and darken around the edges, because his lungs would not work and his chest felt like something had cracked inside it. And panic flooded through him because he was going to suffocate here in this empty arena, while aliens laughed at him. And somewhere deep in his brain, something ancient and primal woke up and screamed that he was in danger, and that he needed to survive. And heat began to build in his chest, spreading outward through his veins like liquid fire. And his vision, which had been fading, suddenly snapped back into crystal clarity, and he could see every detail of the arena, including microscopic scratches on the walls and individual dust particles floating in the air. And the pain in his chest began to fade, replaced by a sensation of overwhelming power that made his skin tingle and his muscles tense. And he realized he was breathing again, but the air tasted different, somehow charged with energy that his body was drinking in with every breath. And the laughter above him started to fade and change into confused muttering. And Tessic made a chittering sound of alarm, and Vorn took a step backward, and Dae Sung slowly pushed himself up from the floor, feeling strength in his arms that had not been there before. And he looked up at the aliens who had been tormenting him and saw fear in their eyes for the first time. And Tessic's translator device rendered his clicking speech as what is happening to his eyes. And Dae Sung did not understand what they meant until he saw his own reflection in the polished metal of a practice dummy, and realized that his eyes were glowing with an amber light that pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. And the light grew brighter as he stood fully upright and stared at Vorn, who had hit him. And the Krell warrior tried to maintain his aggressive posture, but Dae Sung could smell the fear coming off him in waves. And Vorn said something about teaching the human a real lesson, and swung his fist again with full force behind it this time. And Dae Sung's hand moved almost on its own, reaching up and catching Vorn's massive fist in midair and stopping it completely. And the impact should have broken every bone in his hand. But instead, Dae Sung felt nothing except the continuing surge of power running through his body. And Vorn's eyes went wide and he tried to pull his fist back, but could not break free from Dae Sung's grip. And the other aliens began backing toward the doors while making sounds of distress in their various languages. And Dae Sung opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out because he did not know what to say, or what was happening to him. And the glow from his eyes grew even brighter until it cast shadows across the arena floor, and somewhere in the distance alarm sirens began to wail, as the station's security system detected an unauthorized power surge in the sparring arena. And Vorn finally managed to wrench his hand free and stumbled backward, while the other aliens scattered. And Dae Sung stood alone in the center of the arena, with light pouring from his eyes and power humming through his veins and absolutely no idea what he had become. Daesung woke up in a white room that smelled of antiseptic and ozone, with lights too bright shining down from a ceiling he could not quite focus on, and his body felt heavy and strange as though it belonged to someone else, and when he tried to sit up, restraints held him gently but firmly against the medical bed, and a soft chime sounded somewhere to his left, followed by footsteps approaching rapidly, and a woman's voice said in Korean that he needed to stay calm and that everything was going to be explained. And Daesung turned his head to see Dr. Myung standing beside the bed with a medical scanner in her hand and concern written across her face, and behind her stood Commander Yi-jun in his dark uniform with silver insignia that marked him as military liaison. And the commander's expression was grim in a way that made Daesung's stomach clench with worry. And Dr. Myung asked him if he remembered what happened in the sparring arena, and the memories came flooding back in vivid detail, including the pain of being hit, and the fear of suffocating, and the strange power that had surged through his body, and the light that had poured from his eyes. And Daesung tried to speak, but his throat was dry and rough, and the doctor held a cup of water to his lips and told him to drink slowly. And after a few sips, his voice returned, and he asked what was wrong with him and why he had been restrained. And Commander Yi-jun exchanged a look with Dr. Myung before pulling up a chair and sitting down beside the bed, and he began to explain in a quiet voice that what had happened to Daesung was not a malfunction or a disease, but rather something that Earth's government had kept secret from the galactic community for nearly 50 years. And during humanity's chaotic expansion into space, when ships traveled to distant systems without proper shielding, and when early colonists were exposed to exotic radiation, and when desperate governments experimented with genetic modifications to help humans survive on hostile worlds, something unexpected had emerged in a small percentage of the population, and these individuals carried dormant abilities coded into their DNA that could be triggered by extreme stress or mortal danger, and the abilities varied from person to person, but they all shared certain characteristics, including enhanced physical capabilities and rapid healing, and in some cases the ability to manipulate energy in ways that science could not fully explain. And Earth's government had created a secret program to identify and monitor these individuals who were called the Awakened, and the program existed not to weaponize them, but to protect them from being exploited by other species or by Earth's own military-industrial complex. And every human who left Earth for the galactic community was screened for the genetic markers, and Daesung had tested positive, which was why Hyojin had been assigned to watch over him. And the commander's words hung in the air while Daesung processed this information that rewrote everything he thought he knew about himself and his species. And he asked why nobody had told him before. And Dr. Myung explained that most people with the markers never awakened and lived normal lives, never knowing they carried this potential. And telling everyone who tested positive would have caused unnecessary fear and might have led to leaks that would expose Earth's secret. And Daesung felt anger rising in his chest because they had sent him into a dangerous situation without warning him about what might happen. And the restraints on the bed suddenly snapped apart as though made of paper, and both the doctor and the commander jerked backward in surprise. And Daesung looked down at his hands, which were trembling slightly, and realized that he had broken free without even trying. And Commander Yi-jun held up his hands in a calming gesture and told Daesung that he needed to breathe and focus, because the abilities were tied directly to his emotional state, and getting angry or afraid would cause power surges that he could not control yet. And Daesung closed his eyes and forced himself to take slow breaths the way his grandmother had taught him when he was young and anxious, and gradually the tingling sensation in his hands faded, and the lights in the room stopped flickering. And when he opened his eyes again, both the doctor and commander had relaxed slightly, and Yi-jun explained that Daesung would need training to control his new abilities, and that other awakened individuals would help him learn. And there were meditation techniques and physical exercises that would teach him to call upon his power when needed and suppress it when necessary. And the alternative was to send him back to Earth immediately, where he could train in secret facilities away from alien eyes. And Daesung asked what would happen if the aliens found out about the Awakened and learned that humans had been hiding enhanced individuals among the galactic community. And the commander's expression grew even more grave, and he admitted that the diplomatic consequences could be severe, and many species already feared and distrusted humanity because humans had risen too quickly from a single-planet civilization to a spacefaring power, And if those species learned that some humans possessed superhuman abilities, they might demand that Earth be quarantined, or that human expansion be restricted. And worse yet, some of the more predatory civilizations might try to capture awakened humans for study, or experimentation, or breeding programs. And that was why the secret had been maintained so carefully for so long. And now that secret was in jeopardy because Tessik's compound eyes recorded everything they saw, and the footage of Daesung's glowing eyes and impossible strength was already spreading through the station's underground data networks, and security teams were working to contain the footage. But it was probably too late, and Representative Thex, who ran the Academy's security division, was demanding answers and threatening to report the incident to the Galactic Educational Council. And Ambassador Taeyang was traveling to the station right now to handle the diplomatic situation. And everything depended on how the next few days unfolded. And while Commander Yi Jun talked, Daesung noticed that his hand had left a dent in the metal bed frame where he had gripped it unconsciously, and he wondered how he could possibly control this power when it responded to emotions he barely understood himself. And Dr. Myung noticed him staring at the dent and told him that it would get easier with practice and that every awakened person went through this difficult adjustment period. And she pulled up a holographic display showing brain scans and genetic sequences that meant nothing to Daesung, but seemed to fascinate her. And she pointed out areas where his cellular structure had been fundamentally altered during the awakening process, and his cells were now capable of absorbing and storing energy from his surroundings in ways that violated several known laws of physics. And his body had essentially become a living battery that charged itself from ambient radiation and heat and even light, and the more energy he stored, the stronger he became. But he needed to learn to release that energy in controlled ways, or it would burn through him and cause damage. And Daesung asked if anyone had ever lost control completely and hurt people they cared about. And the silence that followed his question told him everything he needed to know. And Dr. Myung finally admitted that there had been incidents over the years, and that was another reason why training was so important. And a soft knock on the door interrupted the conversation, and Hyojin entered the room with her eyes red from crying. And she rushed to Daesung's bedside and grabbed his hand and apologized over and over for not preparing him better, and for failing in her duty to protect him. And Daesung squeezed her hand gently and told her it was not her fault because she could not have known that Vorn would attack him. And Hyojin shook her head and explained that she should have seen the signs, and should have warned him to avoid being alone with those aliens. And she had been trained specifically to watch for threats, and she had failed. And Commander Yi Jun told her firmly that there was enough blame to go around and that recriminations would not help the current situation. And what they needed now was a plan to control the narrative before the galactic community turned this incident into a crisis. And he looked at Daesung with an expression that mixed sympathy with calculation, and asked if the young man would be willing to face the Academy officials and explain what happened. And Daesung nodded slowly because running away would only make things worse, and he owed it to the other humans at the Academy to handle this with courage. And somewhere deep inside him, the power that had awakened hummed quietly like a sleeping tiger, waiting to be called upon again.